I love quantitative research. That was how I started. And then I came to a research question that needed a qualitative approach. And so I had to pull in Barb Hoagland to help me out with that. And that was, rather than being able to use a questionnaire for patient-reported outcomes in cardiovascular health, we needed to develop one. And to be authentic and have good validity, we needed to create one. So pull in your expertise. That's my advice. I wasn't a qualitative methodology expert, so I pulled one in. And then for quantitative, I don't have the time. Teaching at Bethel, being on committees, multiple councils, and writing, then I don't have the time to do my own statistics, so I pull in an expert for that. But it's very important that I'm very clear at the beginning of the plan for data analysis. So that comes from a good proposal. So your funding proposal, if that's clear in there, upfront discussions with your statistician, then even though you don't get results for a year, you know where you were headed then.
I do the entire research process myself, everything from deciding what the experiment's going to be to gathering all the data for every experiment. So I don't have any data pools or data banks out there anywhere where my data are coming from. I have to gather it all. So in my cognitive, this is cognitive research that I do. From the very beginning, have to design the task that I'm going to ask my participants to do, try it out usually on a small pilot group of people, and then collect all my data and then analyze it all too. And then write it all up. So the whole thing I'm doing myself. And so one tip that I had written down that I thought for others who do the same kind of thing as me is that you really have to think about when you're going to do all these different tasks that are part of the process. Because if I'm going to run another experiment, I need participants, and they're coming from Bethel University students usually. So I can only gather data when they're here. I have tried to gather data in the summers before, and it's a total flop, so it's a waste of time. So I have to be thinking far enough ahead to be thinking, all right, when will a certain experiment be ready to run, and then will I have the participants at that time that I can gather the data from? And so that also kind of works in a second little point that I was going to raise today, which is that it helps then if you have more than one experiment in the works at a time, because then I can, if I'm collecting data on one, because this semester I've got enough students in the pool to collect data from, I can be doing something else on the other one. Be working on another piece of the process for another one. So the summers have to be when I do my background research and writing and a lot of data analysis in the summer times. And then during the semesters, I have to collect all my data.
The data analysis in the summer.
Yeah, analysis in the summer.
That's like your hobby.
Once I have it. There's my hobby. Well, not really. No. There's too many other fun things to do in the summer too, aren't there? But it is my summer activity.
I have a question. Do you get big enough sample sizes, or would you like to collaborate with another investigator in another university?
I get large enough. I make sure I get large enough ones for the experiments that I want to run. And so that part works out okay. Well, we've got a little system set up in the department that puts all of our intro students who are taking classes into a subject pool, and so we can all draw from there. Our student researchers draw from that pool as well as those of us. And actually what works out good for me usually, and I'm just kind of gearing up to get this done in a semester, because they're in the subject pool, they have to, these are the intro students, need to participate in a couple of experiments in the department in order to get these little credit vouchers, and it's usually just a small little assignment within their class. They have to do this for, right? So the student researchers in the department are all collecting their data, several weeks. In fact, most of mine are already done. And now in the last 3 weeks or so of the semester, all the panicked students in the pool who haven't done their participation yet will come asking everyone for, are there any experiments left? Is anybody still doing anything that I can participate in, right? So that's when I end up getting sometimes pretty good-sized groups of participants from the panicked ones. Now, this may not give me real good data all the time. They're kind of desperate, and they definitely put it off until this point, so now they just want to get it done somehow in any way that they possibly can. So they're not the best of participants, but
if you ever need to do a stuff
there's
like
plenty of them. I know. Exactly. I've got the perfect gang right there. And there's usually plenty of them. So there you go.
So do they self-report that they've participated, or how do you?
They get a little credit voucher from the experimenter, whoever they do their things for. And we just print these out, and then all of our student researchers get a batch of them, and then they give them out as they have participants do their studies. So that way these vouchers can just go back to the professor of the class, they get turned in, they get their points.
As the lone humanities person on the panel, what I do is, I suppose, a little bit different, but several years ago I had a back injury, and my doctor said, well, what do you do at your job? And I said, well, I sit and read. And then I sit and think about what I read. And then I sit and write about what I thought about what I read. And then sitting actually was the problem leading to the back injury. But in terms of research as a philosopher, what I'm really doing is reading and thinking about ideas. And I think one of the challenges, as Carol was saying, in spacing that out over the course of the academic year is when in that cycle am I going to have time to write? And that's not often. I know I will write nothing this week. It's just that sort of week. But I've learned over time to assign myself tasks for each week, and maybe the only task for a week is I will spend 20 minutes on a search engine seeing what new literature has come out on the topic that I'm researching. I've also learned to have a notebook beside my bed and an open file on my desktop of my laptop that's notes pages for different projects. One document is titled Things I Need to Read. Another document is notes, for this project or notes for that project. So I have a way to document the ideas as they're occurring to me, even if it's not a space and time in which I've designated research and writing time. But then I do have to schedule in projects in terms of I will have this outlined by next week or to be able to keep it going. But I make those assignments based on the rhythm of the academic cycle, which has been helpful to learn how to do.
I have the opposite problem. I have to have people that hold me accountable to say no new projects. No idea file open. Right.
Well, yeah, and along those lines, I have so many files started on projects that I never brought to completion that maybe I'll pick up at some point in time. But for me, I think I mentioned this last time actually, something really effective is to set some sort of deadline, either a conference presentation or a submission to a call for papers, so that it forces me to take the list of notes and turn it into something that then over time is becoming more likely a publishable document.
Should you repeat the question? It's been a while now.
I've found it helpful to recruit students that I work with a little bit. So one thing we haven't talked about that I do is that I get the opportunity to teach a lot of the freshmen. Certainly not most of them, but a lot of the freshmen. And so what I do is computational chemistry. So I write computer programs and I run computer programs for chemistry applications. And so for me, a good student is a student who wants to be a chemistry or biochemistry major, but they're really into math or computers. So a lot of chemistry students are not. particularly into computers or maybe not into math. So that's sort of my niche that I'm looking for. And if I can find or identify a freshman or sophomore who has an inclination in that area, then I may take the chance to talk to them and give them some advice on what courses to take. Oh, if you really like computers, you should take scientific computing with Brian or someone else, to try to set up some good experiences later, because in 1 year is not enough. 2 years, I would say, is barely enough. I think 2 years is enough. And I guess I wanted to mention a few ways that I try to maintain relationships with specialists in my own area. So I think it's kind of obvious it's good for us to have good ongoing collaborations with people at other institutions, but how do we do it? Well, my research is on computers, so that kind of makes it easier in some ways. I can work on something on a computer, and they can be working on more or less the same thing. Besides traveling, and I had a good experience with Google Plus last semester, actually, that I would say was the most positive experience I've ever had on a remote conference. So that's, I think, getting better. I don't have a lot of experience trying to do that, but I think that's getting better. Besides those things, I sometimes send students to these collaborators, research groups. So if you can talk to them about if they're looking for graduate students or they're looking for students or employees or whatever. And occasionally the students will even go there, work there for a summer, and then they'll come back here. And then so I might lose them for the summer, but then they come back more trained than when they left. So sometimes it's me going somewhere else, sometimes it's the students going somewhere else. I do refereeing publications, keeps me in contact with some editors, people who are out there, even though they often arrive at times during the academic year where it doesn't seem helpful. And in my field, there's usually sort of one big conference per year, and I try to get to it. I don't always, but for me, that one conference a year, the most important part of it is the relationships with all the people that I talk to at the meeting. I mean, it's nice to get a quick review on the state of the art in the field, but the relationships are even better. So those were some of the things I thought that are key for me that might be helpful.
Ron, if I could just ask one follow-up to what you were talking about, finding students to work with you. It sounds like you're saying it really does help to catch them early. This is an area in which I have not had very much success at all, is getting students interested enough in my project topic and area to get them involved. I mean, I have some, but just not very much and not to the degree I would like. So, I hear you saying it helps if you really catch them early and you kind of have to get the freshmen and the sophomores. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think it helps. So for you, maybe it's finding a psychology major who likes statistics or who likes biology or who is interested in neuroscience. Or, and even if you don't start working with them, yeah, I think it can help a lot. If they know what you're doing with other students or they just are aware of what you're doing earlier. I have a few times tried to work with freshmen directly just to try to get them going. And sometimes it worked out well and sometimes it didn't, just like you would expect. But on the whole, I think it probably just wasn't a very good, it wasn't a very efficient way to do things. It's just too early.
It's too early, and they don't have enough background
to know if they're interested.
Okay, I gotcha.
But I don't think the sophomore year is really too early. It's certainly not too early to identify.
Great students. So the two students I'm working with right now, one is a junior, one is a sophomore, and they're both really doing well. And it does help. I found it helps to offer an incentive for their work. So in one case, I found one of my research students an internship at the University of Minnesota over the summer. The other one, we had some departmental funds for research, limited, but it's something anyway. And then also course credits. So we do directed study. They get some credits on it. So they've got credits coming out their ears. So it's not like they really need it, but they sort of like that. It goes in the transcript. It has a title, and so that can just make me just a little bit of push for them to sort of. And the other thing is, you can always, if they do substantially contribute, to tell them that they'll be a co-author on the paper. They have to make a significant contribution, but if they do, and there's no guarantee that a publication will come out of it either, whatever you do either, and they have to understand that up front. But for some students, that's really attractive, because maybe they're thinking possibly about graduate school, and hey, if you're an undergraduate applying for graduate school and you have a publication already, that's good. It helps. So that's what I talk to my students about.
In the nursing program, as you may know, we don't actually accept them into the program until halfway through their sophomore year. So there's not as much opportunity to have them be collaborative in research. We don't have directed studies. We have some that have done the honors program that resulted in an article that Barb Hoagland wrote with Jenna Olson that I've assigned this semester for my undergrad students, so that's kind of fun. That was a collaborative writing project, so it wasn't research per se. They wouldn't have that amount of time. So we don't have the luxury of any additional hours. We're actually told by the dean we're not allowed any more credits because we eat them up, and so it would be exciting to be able to have more research opportunities with our undergrads. We don't have that, and so fortunately we do have a master's program, and so I advise master's students, and each year we are able to do some potentially collaborative research and or reviews of the literature, critical reviews, some evidence-based recommendations, and that kind of thing. Dr. Mark Schaefer has authored and co-authored with me and other grad students. And I know she has done stuff with having them be in a collaborative research project. But their master's is not a research-intensive master's. Generally speaking, they don't get done if they're trying to do an independent research project. And so we try to have them piggyback on an existing professor's research project. So the students that I've had undergrad that have worked with me on research, it has had to have been their initiative. For example, I want to do an Edgren with you. Will you do that? And certainly has that's been exciting. But it's really fun because some of our master's students are currently in positions of leadership in the Twin Cities area. So when we do a project or they look at evidence-based guidelines for changing a practice, that change actually does get implemented in practice because they have the authority to do it. And that is really exciting to see an effect that will improve patient outcomes that you're able to see come through to fruition within a matter of a couple of years.
I think it might be helpful if some of you could share your process of actually getting something to the point of publication then. So you've conducted your research, you've got it. Any kind of tricks you've found about deciding where you're going to submit things, how you're dealing with editors, how you're handling revisions, that type of thing. So it's one thing to do all this work, get this piece put together. It's another thing to actually have it appearing in a journal. So just kind of any thoughts you'd have on that, any helpful tips?
For me, the thing that has taken the longest to learn is the patience to do literature review, thorough literature review at the beginning of the project. I see the problem. I have ideas right away about how to address it. I can start playing around with some formulas, some algorithms, some things that can address it, and I sort of want to get going. I want to just get started on it. And I've been burnt once on that, and that was enough. That was enough, yeah. Where I got something all the way to publication place, and one of my reviewers was a friend of mine, sort of friend, colleague that over the years, and I just sent him an email asking if he'd be willing to be the reviewer on this, and I gave him a basic abstract, and he just wrote back and he said, "That's Bell's theorem."
Done. Been there,
and
done
I looked
that.
at it, and it's like, oh.
Shoot.
Yeah, so it is. And ever since then, when I get excited about a project, I discipline myself to do a thorough literature review, and that has so many good implications to it. One of the things that it does is that it connects me to the authors of the research that changes the project from just playing around into actually contributing something to the scientific community and understanding what's not known, what is known. And it also energizes me because I see that's a really good idea, and I also see I think this can be done way better than this person's doing it. And now all of a sudden the project kind of has a direction to it, whereas when I just have an unsolved problem, it's just very, very vague. And so one of the things I've been doing with my research students is I'll have them work the literature review for me, sort of start with some of the, I know these are some of the basic authors and papers, and I'll go to the bibliographies and see, or the references, and see what the other related papers seem to be, and then that kind of brings them up to speed. At the same time, they're bringing me up to speed on what's out there.
Yeah, and one of the things that has helped in terms of the lit review is in terms of choosing publications to submit to, is sort of seeing, well, who's publishing on the topic I'm working on, and where are the leaders in the field being published. For Marion and I, in our publications, over time we've had to build up confidence, and it's kind of a learning project. Our very first article was rejected for publication, and I think if we hadn't worked on it together, I would have just put it in the bottom of the drawer and never worked at it again. But we decided to muster up enough courage that we would send it out to a different journal who accepted it for publication, and we learned right away, and now several publications later, a no, that always try again. If you get a no somewhere, try again. You might get a yes the first time or a yes with revisions, but actually, if you get a no, send the exact same paper someplace else before you try to do anything with it, because it could be who reviewed the article has a particular slant. It could be it's not a good fit for a journal, and so don't be afraid to try sending out a piece to a few different publications.
I would agree with the caveat of you may need to do some revisions before.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Just depending on so have someone experience it with you. If you're not experienced with submitting for publication, sit down with someone who is, and then you're going to create a table, and it's going to be what the reviewer suggested in your response, and then they can work with you to see what is legitimate, and then if you don't agree, how to respond, respectfully. So it's invaluable to have a mentor sit with you to do those first couple of responses when you're writing an article. And mentioning about to where you are submitting, we have a plethora of journals in healthcare, and it really is about the right fit. Who takes this article? Is it too clinical? Is it too research? Is it qualitative? You have to find the right fit, because you're absolutely right. It might be perfect for another journal. Mm-hmm. And that kind of thing you can find out, too, when you go to conferences. And the more you read, and if you're a reviewer, as was mentioned before, you really get a feel for that. So you've got to find a mentor if this is new to you. Absolutely.
I have a question for the panel. Thinking about the open journals where you actually have to pay for publication, if you've had experience with that, what your thoughts are about that, whether or not that's respected in your field or accepted. I just want to know if anybody's had experience with that or what your thoughts are about that.
As a co-author, I have. I don't know if you have yet.
Oh, yeah, well, I was just going to say, in my field, it's not respected, so you don't, unless it's a peer-reviewed, accepted for publication, it's not worth your time. And that's just how my discipline views things. But
yeah, as a co-author, the primary author it got rejected in some journal that she thought was a perfect fit, and she was ready to go to one of the open publishers. I think because she was just demoralized by it, and it isn't. I think fortunately, that she lives in Mannheim, Germany, so she and I were we were doing this all by remote control, and so I wasn't able to sort of tell her, "We just got to. This isn't right, because this is good. This is fine." The reviewers' comments are extremely harsh, and the sort of comments you can't they're basically in their comments they're telling you don't even try to address these. But her supervisor there said, well, it's no big deal. He said, we'll just submit it somewhere else. And then it did take over a year of revisions, but it got published, and she was very glad that it did go that way. So I would say I don't have experience with it, but that experience showed me that it's something to try to avoid, even if it takes a year.
Yeah, they're not real respected in my area either.
Okay.
Although what's starting to happen in psychology are open journals, but with a review process.
Right, yes.
And so some of them are gaining a little bit more respect that way. You still pay yourself to get it in there, but at least somebody's looked at it. Someone knowledgeable has looked at it before it goes in there.
I think the initial idea is to try to get more publications available to countries where they wouldn't otherwise get it, right? I mean, that's the whole point of free access, and I think philosophically we would support that. Unfortunately, I don't have the personal and financial means to support that. So my husband says, you're already writing these articles for free. No, honey, you are not going to take our personal income and pay to have your article published. So I think, if we want to support that institution-wide, if we want to support that philosophy, then we have to make a decision at an institution level that our university would help pay some funds to certain peer-reviewed open access journals that would then benefit developing nations, healthcare in developing nations, or advancement in other nations. So I'm happy to entertain that idea as an institution, but I'm not going to personally finance my work at this point then, when there are other peer-reviewed journals that are available for me to publish in.
I would second that so far there are well-compensated, gatekeepers who control what's respected in the field, and the open journals are still very fringe. I've been invited to be on some editorial boards of some of these journals, which I ignore. It's an interesting question if it's going to change at some point.
I will.
The only thing I would say, sort of like it, will there be sort of communities of sufficiently rigorous, scrutinizing scholars that will sort of break off? The only thing I've seen like it is that we do have in my field, a lot of the work centers around maybe a dozen or two quantum chemistry program packages. So these are software programs that have 1 million lines of code, maybe. Mm-hmm. And so you don't write your own.
Like the Human Genome Project.
Something like that, yeah. So you don't, in that way it's sort of big science, but we don't get the money that the physicists get to build a telescope or something, or a satellite. But there are communities of researchers that are kind of around these software programs, and to contribute to the program is to become an author of the program, and usually an associated paper, and usually to get many citations and to be in this group. So that does kind of exist. I guess I wanted to say, in response to what Kristen said, though, too, not to discount the developing nation access to journals, but even our own access to journals is quite costly. So Elsevier and the American Institute of Physics, for example, are very expensive. Everything from Elsevier is expensive, I think. The last time I checked, the American Institute of Physics wanted $25,000 a year just for Bethel to have the Journal of Chemical Physics. And this is not an obscure journal. This is the #1 probably physics journal in chemical physics.
It's to pay all those reviewers. Oh no, reviewers don't get paid.
Yeah. So there are costs. There are costs that everybody in academia has to face.
Well, then you get the publication black market. I have colleagues sending me emails. Hey, can you get this journal? It's like, maybe. You get one for me now.
With ResearchGate and LinkedIn, that is an issue. I don't know if you're familiar with ResearchGate, but I'm on there, and one article that wasn't even primary research, one that I did with my degree completion, Bethel students in the evening, is very popular, very asked for, and I'm constantly caught, with, well, gosh, can I send it to them? I really don't think I could just send it to them. People from different countries asking for this on the pin site care, for orthopedic pin site. Apparently it's a really hot topic. I didn't know it was going to be that popular, but yeah. One other thing that is becoming more popular right now is these massive databases from a registry for research. I don't know if you have that in your fields. Which was, when you were mentioning it, reminded me of, for example, a big registry for heart lung transplant, for example. So just a lot of questions about what's appropriate for data mining in that area, and then trying to be a spokesperson, as I was at a conference last week, realizing that one of these large databases doesn't collect race as a categorical variable. Is that ethical to not include race? I think 20 years ago someone might have said, "Oh yeah, it's better that way. We're all colorblind." Well, that's not true. If you ask someone who needs to know whether or not a particular drug is metabolized at a different rate in their race, we need to know that variable. So just trying to speak up, and that's why it's so important to go to these conferences, the international conferences or the national conferences, and find out what work is being done in the national databases.
I'm going to throw a couple wild cards here. I promised I'd come with a couple surprises, maybe.
Yeah, we're fighting our nails.
Oh, yeah. This first one will have to do a little bit with what we were talking about in our last session, the idea of trying to balance out being a researcher and being a teacher, at Bethel. And I'm going to read a quote that comes from, it's a book called Inspired College Teaching. It's a Josie Bass 2010 book. Mary Ellen Weimer is the author of it. And the quote goes like this, and I'm curious what your thoughts are. Other research documents that the vast majority of faculty do not realize the ideal of excellence in both research and teaching. Fairweather's thorough and rigorous analysis puts the percentage at 10. These results strongly suggest that the faculty member who simultaneously achieves above average levels of productivity in teaching and research, the complete faculty member, is rare. And it goes on to say, well, before any of this empirical verification, Ebley, with his usual insight cryptic style, observed, research is about as compatible with undergraduate teaching as lions are with lambs. Only by one devouring the other are they likely to lie down compatibly side by side. Your take on that?
Like a true false?
I didn't even throw the lion, lamb, and then what animal would service be? I didn't even throw in the third category of expectations.
I guess I have a minor related comment, which is that one thing I have done is that I've started to scrutinize if I'm talking about changing something about my teaching, changing something about the class, the books, the assignments, whatever. Is this change going to contribute to a substantial increase in student learning? Because I do feel confronted with an infinite number of ways that we can tweak. We can tweak and tweak and tweak and tweak. And for good or ill, I don't know. I've reached the point where the first question I ask is, even if this is fine, is this likely to make a significant difference in the amount of learning that the students are doing? And if I think the answer is no, or the answer is marginal, then I'm probably just going to forget it.
Along those lines, one thing I have found that I have to do in the summer times is not let myself start prepping for fall until August.
Yes.
It's something about having a sort of compulsive nature, like we probably most of us do, and the prep for classes. I don't know how it gets so prominent in my mind that I have to get all this ready, but I just have to lay down the law and say that June and July are going to be my months for my research, and then I'll start prepping in August, and however ready I am when the semester begins is how ready I am. Mm-hmm. So, if all those dreams I had for changing my classes don't happen, then they don't happen. But what else are you going to do?
For me, because I love teaching so much, it's easy for teaching to consume all of my time and thought life. And I've had to learn, actually Wayne Rosa told me this years ago, that if I don't schedule scholarship time and treat it with the sacredness I would treat class time. If somebody asks me if I can go to a meeting when I'm scheduled to be teaching, the answer is automatically no. It's got to be the same for when I block out my research time, and otherwise it's not going to happen.
Yep.
Well, here's another quote. We'll finish with this one. It's along similar lines, but a little bit different twist to it, too. The myth persists that faculty members can do it all, that some sort of symbiotic relationship exists between teaching and scholarship that allows one to feed the other. The myth persists, even though the two require very different skill sets. For a cogent listing of both, see Prince, Felder, and Brent, who say in this summary, the primary goal of research is to advance knowledge, while that of teaching is to develop and enhance abilities. And it goes on to say, a large collection of studies denies the existence of a reciprocal beneficial relationship between teaching and research. Several impressive meta-analyses, various authors are mentioned here, confirm that the two activities are not related. Okay, so thoughts?
Meta-analysis says they're not related?
They are not related.
Oh, they're
Correct.
wrong. They're wrong.
So we talked about that a little bit the first time. I'm just curious your thoughts on that. We did talk a little bit about some connections that might exist, so just curious your take on it.
If you compartmentalize it like two silos, then that's correct. But that's not the approach that I think we're trying to take here. We're trying to say, when we get excited about research, we can share it with our students. That excitement is contagious. And then when we have examples of the textbook scientific method, the students wake up when we flesh it out in day-to-day examples. So that's where it doesn't have to be reciprocal. I mean, I can understand if someone is separating in silos, their research, and teaching. But that's not the way it's meant to be. It's meant to be contagious because you're so enthusiastic and you're explaining to your students, hey, you know what? Your textbook says we're still using this product. We're not. I'm here to tell you that, I was involved in a study where it showed that product wasn't helpful. Or talking about your trials with elderly patients when you're trying to teach geriatrics. And then they get a contagious enthusiasm for what exactly research should be.
I imagine my research, I think it does work best here at the undergraduate level, is that my research is like a train, and it's my job to keep the train sort of going. And students get on the train, and they're on it for a while, and they get off the train. But what was described, seemed to be described there at one hearing was almost like someone was just going down without stopping to let the students on the train, which is imaginable, right? Mm-hmm. You could do this, but how do you teach the ability, which was one contrast, but how do you teach the ability to handle data carefully? Well, you could try to communicate that you have to be very careful with data in a lecture, right? But it would seem that it would be much more effective to actually experience doing that with a student, for example. And some activities like the program is crashing, why? How do we figure out, what do we do now? How do we figure out how to debug this thing? It would seem to be much more easily taught in a research approach than in sort of a classical teaching approach.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, I get what the author's saying. I do get that because if you're doing research that's at the level of scholarly journals and what is current in the field, that's very different. It is over here relative to what you'd be presenting in the classroom. But what I would say, though, sort of contrary to that, is if you're presenting your own research and you're trying to present that to students, there's two things that it does that helps me. First of all, it helps me generalize because I sort of think, what do they know, what do they don't know? And I have to think about what are the connections for what they should already know to what I'm doing. And I'm really helping myself when I do that, because I'm stepping back from the details of my research and thinking about what are the generalities that anybody would understand who has, let's say, is a junior in this class of this. And many times I'll walk away from those lectures thinking, I know what I need to do. And another thing that can happen is a student will ask an unexpected question that's not right, and you sort of go about explaining. What I usually start with is, okay, let's figure out what would happen if we applied that idea here, and usually we come up to some place where this is why that's not used. But it's happened more than once where I'll kind of turn around and say, but if we took that idea and then did this with it instead, then now I'm thinking differently. They sort of pull me out of my little train. It's like they make me stop the train, as it were, and talk to the passengers about where they're going and where I'm going, and all of a sudden it's a different feeling about it. Sometimes I can get literally a new idea from talking to students when they don't know anything really about what's going to be in the journal.
I've had that kind of experience too, but not very often. So I think if I were going to answer this question, I have to kind of partition things. I think the research and the teaching relate for me not very much in the actual content of what I'm doing research on. Because I remember hearing this in a conversation many years ago too, Mike Holmes actually saying the same thing about his research. What it would take to actually talk about our research with the students at the level that they are right now would be so much, training and background and prep and everything that it's just not worth trying to actually bring the content of what you're doing to the class in our area, in Mike's area, and probably some of our others. But the connections are in other ways because I teach research students. The things I can bring into the classroom and talk with them about are process kind of things. So a couple weeks ago when I'm talking to them about drafting their papers, I said, well, here's what your assignment is, and here's where I am too in this project that I've been working on. And here's my stack of resources, and here's how I did my outline to try to do this rewrite. And I showed them my critiques from the reviewers and said, and so it's a connection, not really on the content, but more on the process.
Right.
And that seems to be about all that I've really had a lot of success in using. I hope that they catch some of the process from modeling that I try to do. I try to kind of just show them how you do it, and even if they're not going to get in that actual project, involved in that actual project, then they at least gain from it.
It's so funny to hear you say that, because just today, with my junior nursing students, I had them peer review each other's geriatric brochures, and then I talked about peer review for an article that I had just done in geriatrics. And so, but I think I would challenge, if you think that you can't explain your research topic to the undergrad, I think you should do prime time, because they make you bring it to the level of the audience. That was so challenging. I think a couple years ago I had to do with ischemia, like ST segments of the cardiac waveform was my topic, the ed current student. And I thought, how can I not bore everyone, And I had to do it, because that was the fireside presentation. So I think sometimes you just have to make yourself do it.
I think, too, there's also, there's a lot of faculty here, myself included, that in my department, 70% of our teaching is in gen ed. I might be teaching an area in my specialty once a year, but more often I'm really only teaching in my specialty every other year. Mm-hmm. So what I'm doing in research often doesn't directly relate. I'm not a scholar in environmental ethics in terms of what I'm publishing. Do I stay abreast of the literature? Sure. I'm not publishing in gender studies, even though I'm abreast of the literature. I'm not a scholar in Christianity and Western culture. So much of my teaching work content-wise, has absolutely nothing to do with what with what I'm interested in as a philosopher. But I love both. I mean, I'm not saying that that's critical and that I'm not qualified, to teach what I'm teaching. Those sorts of things. So, I do try to look for things that are surprising. When in the classroom, I give students a certain assignment or a certain reading or those sorts of things. I often find that I'm surprised by what something a student does with an idea actually makes me think about a research piece a different way. A few years ago, Marion and I were doing, we do our Learning to Listen project with interfaith dialogue, and we realized that our students were actually learning quite a lot about racial and class privilege by learning about religious privilege, which was a concept that they, hadn't thought of before. And actually that led us to publish a piece that's been quite popular, and led to some other opportunities on Christian privilege and, and some of the challenges of that. So I think that sometimes classroom surprises me, but I also think you can be a productive teacher and a productive scholar when there's very little overlap between the two.
Well, I think we'll finish off here. Again, I want to thank our panelists a lot for both sessions you've been to. Really appreciate your time and wish you well in your research, in your teaching, in your service, and everything else at Bethel. But thanks for being here, though. Appreciate it.